warm welcome to this ECFR private conversation on the COVID crisis. One threat, many responses. My name is Lykke Friis, and the most important task in my life, except sort of running this think tank, is sort of to be one of the co-chairs of ECFR. I also remember one of the first sort of sessions we had when the COVID crisis hit us. Carl Bildt, one of my fellow co-chairs, he said, well, I hope your summer cottage is nice, Lykke, because you're going to stay there for the next many, many months. And I thought, well, this was sort of one exaggeration. It turned out to be an understatement, unfortunately, because by the late spring, a third of the world's population were basically effectively in house arrest. And those of us who dreamed going to our offices to work, or just going to a football match, or maybe sort of a music festival, well, we still have to be very patient. However, from a purely academic point of view, this is obviously what the Germans would call a Schlaraffenland, because, well, we have one problem, one threat, and sort of all these various sort of approaches to it. That must be a dream for anybody dealing with comparative studies. So we have all these sort of national responses, from the Swedish to the Chinese model, South Korean, South American. Well, you can basically continue the list yourself. So what we'll discuss today is, why is this the case? This variety, why do governments act so differently to the same crisis? Do we see any kind of patterns that can help us in understanding the differences, except the national character of Sweden, which we Danes always like to joke about, or the geographical distance to the skiing resort Ischgl in Austria? And to make us a lot wiser on these particular issues, we have two scholars among us who have both had the courage to write a book on the crisis. We have Professor Peter Baldwin from UCLA. You have sort of a book coming out just in a couple of weeks' time, and it's called Fighting the First Wave: Why the Coronavirus Was Tackled So Differently Around the World. And one of the reasons you wrote that book was that it literally spared you from climbing the walls in East Sussex. That's at least what you write in the book. And I should say that Peter is half Danish, so we thought about having this session in Danish, but then Ivan, our next speaker threatened us that he would do it in Bulgarian. So I think we better stick to English. And Ivan, my friend, colleague on the ECFR board, you have written the book, Is It Tomorrow Yet? Paradoxes of the Pandemic. And that book already came out late summer last year, so you were really fast. And we have agreed that we'll have sort of brief introductions, 5-6 minutes. Let's see how that goes. Peter, the floor is yours. Ordet er dit.
Thank you. The book is out on Thursday, just in case anyone.
Just around the corner.
So I've been given 5 minutes. I will be as brief as I possibly can. COVID presented the same medical problem everywhere, but there wasn't any uniform response. And basically, I think we can divide the responses across the world into three basic approaches. First, you have the targeted quarantines that one finds in Asia. You either quarantined areas that were infected in the way the Chinese did, or you quarantined the rest of the world out the way New Zealand did. Secondly, there was a mitigation strategy. You let the epidemic sweep through your nation. You accepted the high mortality this brought with it in hopes, in turn, of getting herd immunity eventually. A number of nations did this, but most prominently the Swedes. And finally, there was what most of us lived through, namely lockdown, the tactic that was followed by most Western democracies. They were the countries that found it impossible to act as quickly or as drastically as the Asian nations. And they were the countries that were not brave enough to count on herd immunity in the way that the Swedes did. So my question is, in the book, why such differences? And I want to make three basic points here in an attempt at an answer. First of all, to start with, it was the same disease the world over, COVID, but it wasn't the same pandemic. Geography played a role. It was simply a different problem in different places. Not everywhere was hit equally hard. Some places were simply off the beaten path. Eastern Europe was not hit as hard the first wave. The Midwest in the US was hit less hard in the beginning than the two coasts were. Places like New Zealand and the Pacific Islands could and simply did keep the epidemic out. So geography is one aspect. There are also biological issues here, and I speak now with some trepidation because I'm not a medical person, so I'm simply channeling what I read. But there seem to have been some biological variables at work as well that explain why the pandemic was less pressing in some places. In the so-called Buddhist triangle, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, there's an apparent issue of possible cross-reactive immunity from various previous infections that may help explain why their infection rates are so much lower than elsewhere. And at a larger level, there's the possibility that the hygiene hypothesis, in fact, may be real and may have spared some nations the worst sorts of ravages. If you look at the incidence and mortality rates, excuse me, in India and Pakistan, they are far less than even a tenth of the US and the North European rates. It's of course possible the statistics are a bit wonky here. You have to adjust for demography. These are populations that are much younger. But even so, the differences are really dramatic and cry out for an explanation. And it is possible that there is something of a silver lining here, in the sense that too much sanitation may be a bad thing. And then finally, in the realm of speculation, there is the association between obesity and mortality. The vast majority of deaths have taken place in countries where over 1/2 the population is overweight, so there may be an issue here. In any case, my point is simply that there are variables that explain why the pandemic was not the same everywhere. My second point, given that it wasn't the same problem everywhere, the question is, what explains the differences among nations that faced much the same predicament? Before you have a medical solution, the way we are slowly getting to one now, dealing with a pandemic is above all a political problem. The question is, how do you get citizens to do what they have to do to avoid infection and to avoid spreading it? Well, you can either order them about and you can enforce those orders, or you can rely on some sort of persuasion or compliance and hope that your citizens will do so on their own, do what they have to do on their own. Now, obviously, autocratic regimes have a bigger toolkit. They can impose more drastic measures on their citizenry without having to worry about blowback. But not every autocracy did well in this pandemic. Iran, Nicaragua, Russia, these weren't exactly poster boys for an effective response. Just because you have the tools doesn't mean that you can use them well. And among those nations that did best were not just autocracies, of course, but many democracies: Taiwan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. So it's not just the political system that helps explain the divergent outcomes. There must have been other sorts of factors as well. Among these, it seems to me, are the nature of the political leadership. The speed with which decisions were taken, could be taken in epidemic circumstances where the pandemic grows exponentially was crucial. Waiting a week could mean that you had twice as many cases. The consistency with which judgments were taken was also crucial. Inconsistency was a huge weakness. The UK, for example, switched horses in March from mitigating to locking down instead. And in the time after that, the UK leadership undertook a whole number of policy U-turns afterwards, opening and closing travel and that sort of thing. In the same sense, the US suffered from geographical inconsistency. It didn't impose a national response across the nation. It allowed various states to do largely what they pleased. So the nature of the leadership is one thing, but then from the other side, the nature of citizens' attitudes to their leadership was also crucial. Compliance was important. You know, the Prime Minister of New Zealand spoke of her team of 5 million, but how many other leaders could count on that kind of buy-in? The more fragmented, the more polarized society and politics were, the less leaders could hope for acceptance of the measures that were required. Some nations simply had more voluntary compliance, could rely on more voluntary compliance, could rely on more trust in the state than others. And at the same time, some nations deliberately reduced their compliance, in the case of the democracies, by emphasizing civil rights in the middle of a pandemic. In a sense, you could argue that democracies hobbled their response by emphasizing civil rights. I just want to give or throw out 2 examples of what I mean. Tracing apps on mobile phones were effectively rendered useless in most democratic nations by the insistence of privacy advocates that they be allowed to track proximity but not location, and that any response, any measure for the tracking apps be voluntarily entered in them, so that they were effectively almost pointless. And a similar argument can be made about the protests against masks. The idea that having to wear a mask in public is somehow a violation of civil liberties is too ridiculous to merit discussion if it weren't for the fact that millions of our fellow citizens seem to have thought that that was the case. Why that is something that I think democracies are going to be asking themselves for years to come. And of course, even weirder is where this response to the masks was most virulent. The Asians take masks completely for granted. The Americans had a lot of reaction against masks, but on the whole, compliance was good. Oddly enough, the strongest reaction against masks, not just from left and right-wing extremists, but from government authorities themselves, came in Western Europe and above all in Scandinavia. That too is something that deserves an explanation, and I don't necessarily have it. That leads me to my final point, and that is that so far I've been talking about the public health response as such, but that's only one aspect of the overall response. To the public health response comes also the medical response, comes vaccines. Where do these vaccines come from? Well, with the exception of China, they didn't come from those nations that handled the public health response best. They came precisely from those nations that most flubbed the public health response, above all the US and the UK. So the best actors in the medical response have been very different from the best actors in the public health response. And we're now seeing something similar with the rollout of the vaccines. The Europeans are not doing very well with this. Meanwhile, the UK and the US are pushing ahead. So the question is, why were the nations that failed in public health terms the victors when it came to the medical response to vaccination? And it seems to me that the answer there is simply that technology trumps politics. Western democracies had a hard time responding in public health terms because that involved demanding sacrifices of citizens who weren't very willing to concede much or to comply very well. A medical solution allowed the leaders of these semi-ungovernable democracies to sidestep the political complications that were involved in demanding sacrifices of their citizens. We see this trade-off between technology and politics most starkly in Israel. Israel has shown the rest of the world how to do vaccination. They were willing to pay a 40% premium to get the necessary supplies, and they then unleashed a centralized and efficient health apparatus to do its magic. Why has Israel been so eager to get vaccination right and to do it right? It seems to me the answer is that a technological fix like vaccines allowed its leaders to sidestep what would otherwise have been an unwelcome, but now an unnecessary confrontation with the ultra-Orthodox among themselves. The ultra-Orthodox are people who have habits that are very hard to contain in lockdown. They make up 12% of the population. They make up 60% of the cases in major hospitals. With vaccination, what had threatened to become a political headache is now simply gone. So different aspects of the response have led or have brought out very different actors, and nations in retrospect are seen to be doing different kinds of responses or being and achieving them better or worse, depending on which aspect of the response to the pandemic that we're talking about. That's it. I don't know if I got in under 5 minutes or not.
Excellent, brilliant. And also, I mean, from a Danish point of view, I was very interested you mentioned Israel, because some of you will know the Danish Prime Minister just went to Israel together with the Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz last week. But let's go to Ivan. So we go to Sofia, to a wonderful bookshelves we can see. So how do you explain the various differences in Europe? And is it true that you have already been vaccinated? Ivan, over to you.
Yeah. I did. And first, I very much want to recommend you Peter's book, because I had the pleasure to read it preparing for this discussion. And when I was writing my book, it was very early on. The book was finished in April. And the question that struck me was just the opposite to the Peter. My question was how it happened that, and I'm a political scientist, why such a different political regimes responded in such a similar way. In a certain way, if you see March and April, when it was not very much clear what was going on, you can see basically countries going under the lockdown. And if you're going to try to predict what is going to be the initial reaction of a certain government or a country, the nature of the political regime doesn't matter. You cannot understand who go for lockdown and who not. You're not going to understand now, by the way, about vaccination. Strangely enough, the story about the nature of the political regime turns to be quite weak in explaining the differences also that Peter was talking about. But the other thing that struck me was that in these 2 months, and of course this is true all this 1 year, we see a very strange dictatorship, and this is the dictatorship of comparisons. All the time, basically, people are controlling their government by comparing what is happening in other countries, what kind of infection numbers, what kind of deaths, what kind of basically success of vaccination. And I find this extremely, extremely interesting and politically powerful, because what is happening is to try to see who is maximizing what. And of course, Israel is a great example, and I very much agree with what Peter said, but there is one more explanation why basically Netanyahu took the course he took, and this is that he has an election this month. And on the moment of the elections, the people are asking a simple question: what it means for the government to succeed. And for the government to succeed, you have a 3-type of dimension in which you can claim success: the number of people infected, the number of people dying, or the number of people being vaccinated. And paradoxically, the third one is the one on which government can really deliver. And I find this very important, because being East European, in May and June, I was always asked to explain why Eastern Europe was doing so well. And in November and December, I was asked to explain why Eastern Europe is doing so badly. I didn't have an answer of both cases, but I found something quite important, and this is that the winners of the first wave can very easily turn into the losers of the second. ECFR had this big survey which shows how much Europeans were surprised and basically shocked by the failure of the United States and the United Kingdom exactly during this kind of a public health part of the crisis. But we're going to end up in the autumn, and then we're going to discover that Americans and Brits are doing better. They're going to have much easier to normalize their societies exactly because of the number of the vaccinations. And also what struck me, and this is something which I do believe is really brilliantly done in Peter's book, is that it's interesting to understand what we learned as a society out of this crisis. And I just want to make one point, because in order to have a much more time for a broader discussion. The thing that really struck me about the European Union is the level of how risk-averse European societies are. You can see this, for example, with AstraZeneca. And you can see that in a certain way, you don't have statistically significant kind of a deviations that can explain the government's decisions to close and basically say that we're not going to use the vaccine. But at the same time, the government is so much under the pressure to try to show to the people that they're taking all necessary measures in order to protect their lives, that they are ready to risk, to be honestly, hundreds of lives now by delaying vaccinations, particularly in countries where AstraZeneca is the major vaccine that they have bought, just basically to reassure the public. And this kind of a low risk and risk-averse position of the European governments made me to believe that not simply that we are not ready to ask societies for sacrifice, I do believe that governments in some of the Western democracies are promising people something that even God never dared to promise, that they're going to be immortal. And this type of a story, that on one level, the pandemics is making us aware of our own mortality, which we have slightly forgotten about. And on the other, this kind of a position of the governments that any death is either the result of a crime or bad accident, the unnatural nature of death. I do believe there is telling something very important about why it's so difficult to govern. And I want to end up here, because for me, and this was the reason I decided to publish a book so early, with the pandemics, I always believe it's easier to write in the very beginning or when it is over. Because in the very beginning, you have just your questions and intuitions. And in the middle, it is very messy, because we don't know how it's going to develop. We don't know when it is going to end and for whom it is going to end. But the question that is very much in Peter's book, and I do believe is also central for me, is we are claiming and we're making our understanding of the world very much based on the central contradiction between democracies and authoritarian regimes. If this is the case, why in the case of the pandemic the nature of the political regime was such a bad explainer of what kind of policies are going to be adopted and how successfully they're going to be adopted.
Fascinating. So the dictatorship of comparison is a new term, at least for me. Peter, what are your sort of reflections also on the differences between the first wave and the second wave? Were you there surprised by some of the countries that acted sort of differently in the second wave compared to the first wave, or what are your reflections on that? Over to you.
Thank you. Well, I don't know who the proverbial fat lady who sings is, or is supposed to sing is, but you know, the old bit about it's not over till she does seems to hold very true of pandemics. And in a sense, you know, the Swedes all along have been saying, don't judge us yet, don't judge us yet. We need to look at mortality when 5 years out, or at least once the second wave is hit, because, you know, we're allowing the higher mortality now, but we'll have lower mortality later. And in a sense, that's very wise. I mean, I think they're wrong, but in terms of how they themselves are going to fare. But I think it's a very wise position to take, because we're always being surprised by the next development. And even in the case of the Chinese, for example, or some of the other Asian nations, or New Zealand for that matter, I don't necessarily think New Zealanders are going to flub it. But the point is, these are all nations that right now have no herd immunity whatsoever. They're not rolling out vaccine very quickly. The Chinese certainly aren't. I mean, oddly enough, the Chinese and the Russians too, you know, they have this vaccine that actually has passed muster. And what are they doing with it? They're selling it to Africa, or in the case of Russia, to India, right? They're not administering it to their own people. Their own people are rather vaccine hesitant, as I understand it, because from their point of view is, hey, we solved this problem. We can go to the movies and sports events and so forth. What's the big issue? Well, the big issue, of course, is, you know, unless you want to keep the rest of the world out to the, you know, the next generation, you can't go back to a normal life, at least only with fences around you. So, you know, things may change even in places that have dealt with it successfully. I mean, that's effectively the lesson of the second wave. So, you know, we don't yet know. Can I just say one thing, one point of response to Ivan on a slightly separate topic?
Sure.
Of course, right, that Netanyahu had elections to win, but can I just point out, you know, Merkel had an election to win too, and Trump had an election to win, and that didn't seem to make much difference to their tactics. You know, of course, politicians want to win elections, but, you know, the thing is, different politicians focus on different things depending on the structural framework that they find themselves in.
Brilliant, thanks a lot. Ivan, I mean, I could clearly understand your point about when to publish a book. Thank you very much for that advice. But I mean, if you could sort of write that first book sort of now in the second wave, what was the biggest surprises for you? I mean, where were you too fast, so to speak?
Oh, no, there was many things that for sure are going to be different. One of the interesting things for me, and this was partially part of my answer to the question, why governments, even with which are very low infection rates and not knowing what is going on, decided to go for the lockdown, was that in this classical book by Frank Knight, which was written just after the Spanish flu, by the way, the difference between uncertainty and risk. When you don't know what is going on, you should go with the worst case scenario. But secondly, what is very important, do what others do, because otherwise you're taking a lot of risk. And from this point of view, what I found very interesting in Peter's book was that Sweden, by deciding to be exceptional, on one level, they benefited a lot because there was a pride of population, there was a trust, we're doing better than others, but they were deprived of something that, in my view, is very important for response to the pandemics, and this is flexibility. To be ready to change when the circumstances start to change. Because of the fact that you became a model, because of the fact that you have been called so exceptional, you're standing even when you're not sure how well it works for you. And I'm saying this because there were two things on which I was very much wrong. I didn't expect that China was going to do so well. I mean, also from the point of view of what was going to be the geopolitical outcome, at least for this moment. And of course it can change. But even on this level, look, European Union now, by basically delegitimizing AstraZeneca, is making it impossible to enter in a big way to the out of the Western world, because this is the only cheap vaccine that we have produced. For countries like China and Russia, the idea that they're going to use this type of a pandemics in order to show for Russia technological importance. It's not by accident that Sputnik 5 was the first one being announced by the Russian government, that they should be counted among the big science powers in the world. I do believe all this matters, and strangely enough, democracies which normally can expect to be much more interested in the outside world and basically much more in this cooperation discussion and others, it didn't figure out. And the other thing that I do believe I got wrong was that I expected, because of the nature of the crisis, which was a public health crisis, we're going to see certain regaining of the trust in experts and expertise. Because when it comes to the personal health, when it comes to the public health, people are much more ready to trust the doctors than the foreign policy experts. At least in the part of the world I am in, this is not the case. In a strange way, basically, the crisis of the trust in any type of a scientific knowledge and any type of a scientific expert knowledge is becoming very high. So all this idea that as a result of the pandemics, we are going to end up with a politics which is much more based on expertise, I find it more and more problematic. And even now governments like the German government or the Swedish government that try to very much bet on the scientific nature of their decisions, they find it very difficult basically to convince their own publics that this is how it works.
I cannot resist sort of coming out now with a quote by from Peter's book. It's by a Swedish government co-advisor, and he wrote the following, or said the following: "The reason Sweden's strategy distinguishes itself internationally is because everyone else is wrong." I think that's a rather sort of fascinating sentence. Before I sort of move to you, I mean, for questions, I was just wondering, what are the core lessons here for Europe? I mean, we are the European Council on Foreign Relations, so the chances of developing a common sort of response to pandemics, when we see so much variety also within Europe, I mean, how do you see the chances of developing such a common response?
So, Peter,
do you want to go first?
I'm not an expert on EU politics. I will make one remark prompted by Ivan, or a reflection prompted by Ivan, and that is the question of the mixture between politics and science. Why are European politicians issuing opinions about technical stuff like vaccines? And why is the French president, have opinions on this? It's a mystery to me that you really want to sort of get involved in that. As you say, it takes tools out of your arsenal and just means that your hands are that much more tightly tied. It seems the last thing that politicians should be doing.
For me, what was interesting, and this very much comes from this survey that we did during the summer with ECFR. There was this initial period in which everybody criticizing European Union for doing nothing, and there was a good reasons they were doing nothing, because it was not in the mandate of the Union to work on many of these public health issues, which are very much in the domain of the national governments. But as a result of the fact that European Union was absent, suddenly we ended with the public opinion that come with the conclusion that we need more European Union, we need more European cooperation. Then suddenly European Commission decided to take the lead on the vaccine and vaccinations. And I do believe that when we're going to have the next survey, we're going to see that as a result of this leadership, basically the trust of the European Union probably is going to decline than to increase. And one of the stories that European Union, and particularly European Commission, is not best prepared for the emergency politics. And this is about the timing of the decision making, how fast you're taking decision, but also how risk you can take. For example, Netanyahu has decided to pay 40% more, and secondly, to give the data to Pfizer in order to make Israel much more interesting for the company to deliver to him. Because for him, the most important was to achieve what he's going to achieve, early vaccinations. If you see how the European Commission was negotiating, nevertheless that they represent a much bigger and very wealthy market, they try to be right on everything. The price should be low. Everything should be transparent. The fairness of the countries and so on. And this created a situation in which many national leaders, in order to show to their publics that they care about them, they start breaking the European rules. Either you're going to take the Russian and the Chinese vaccines, which were not licensed by the European medical authorities, or you'll go with the initiative like the Danish, Austrian, or like the meeting today of the 6th Central European Prime Minister. So in a strange way, this is for me one of the paradoxes that I see very much. And I was thinking what von der Leyen could have done differently if she was thinking much more in a classical political terms. And honestly speaking, I do believe that instead of simply negotiating on behalf of the member states, she should have 10 million doses, which are owned by Brussels, and to be given to the most vulnerable countries. And quite often the most vulnerable countries are exactly the countries that have elections. Because this is also securing the democratic process. Because suddenly now the governments, particularly in an election period, they find their best election strategy blaming the European Commission for everything that goes wrong, many things that the European Commission has nothing about it. And this is kind of the paradox of activity and absence of activity of the European Commission. Obviously, the European Union is doing best when it is absent.
Thank you, Ivan. I'm not sure that Sebastian Kurz, the Austrian Chancellor, would agree with you on that sort of last sort of creative proposal. But we'll get back to sort of also to vaccine nationalism. But now actually I just want to make one point here also from the chat where sort of one puts the important point that one should maybe not compare sort of Israel to the big European Union, but that was just an important insight here. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Ivan. Do read the books. You don't have to wait that long time for Peter's book. You can already read Ivan's book. You
can even reread it.
What, sorry?
You can even reread it.
You can reread it. Yeah, no, I did that for this session actually, but I read the German version. I'm not sure what the Danish one is out yet. But thank you very much. Also, thank you very much to our participants. I checked this morning sort of my calendar and I saw that it's now 45 today. It's 45 years since Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister, stepped down. And as you all remember, said a week is a long time in politics. And so I'm pretty sure that you will have both Peter and Ivan sort of many sort of new sort of ideas and sort of points that you can write in a new book, but I hope that you will not have to write in a lockdown, because I hope that we will soon be able to get out of this COVID-19 crisis. But without further ado, thank you very much. Thank you for spending the time with us. Thank you very much, ECFR, and see you all soon.